This is our first conversation about the Constitution. We appreciate you joining us. My name is Sarah Santana. I am the State Director for Convention Estates here in Michigan. And this is my co-host, Chet Grant, who will be helping us understand this material. I'd like to introduce you to our panel and our background people who are going to help make all of this possible. So first off, Robin Riddell. Robin, you got to wave and stuff. Robin is going to be making the world turn behind the scenes. So you may not be seeing her, but she is going to make sure that we see all your comments and questions. So huge thank you to Robin. I want to introduce Bruce Finlayson. You have to wave, Bruce. Bruce is joining us from up north. He is one of our regional captains, does an amazing job. Then we have John Phillips. John Phillips is joining us from Southeast Michigan. Thank you, John. And last but not least, we have Shay Bonag, who you may have read his work. He does our Federal Fritters blogs, which are amazing. So thank you all for joining us. And what we're going to do is we're going to be going through Article 1 of the Constitution as well as the preamble. And we're going to kind of summarize it for you, and then we're going to kind of discuss it. And if you have thoughts about it, please jump in the comments section. Let us know your questions. Let us know your thoughts. We're going to try to really understand this material. There's a lot of conversations about the Constitution, about democracy, about protecting our country and what we stand for. And it's hard to understand what all that means if we don't understand our founding document. So we're going to kind of jump in there. I'm going to hand it over to Chet. Chet, why don't you take it away?
Okay. So it took our ancestors, our colonists, our framers, eventually about 150 years to get to where we are today with our Constitution. And so as you get into this, it starts off with a very short paragraph, which I will read. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So what does that tell us? It's kind of setting the tone for what's to come in the rest of the document. It's providing an overview, guidance as to what our framers had in mind as they set about this very important task of creating our Constitution. There were a lot of attempts at getting to where we are, the Articles of Confederation being the most significant one. But with this paragraph, they're letting us know what they're creating and what that content is. So that's how this all starts off. All right, so going from that,
I really think that.
Go ahead.
This is a reason that we the people need to stay engaged in the political process, because the purpose here is to secure the welfare and the blessings of liberty to both ourselves and also our children and our children's children. And I know that's why I've been involved in Convention of States and the political process in general, is to actually have a say in what will happen in the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's also kind of significant because it shows us the priorities of the founder when they were making this document. They wanted a government that was going to be focused on defense, that was going to be focused on justice, and focused on creating an environment where people could thrive. And so when you look at it in that perspective, I guess it gives us the opportunity to look at our government today and say, is our government today living up to that standard?
Particularly in the area of liberty, which is so much what about Convention of States is about, right?
Absolutely.
So you think about it, these guys are pretty smart.
Oh, yeah.
They got together, they talked about putting a constitution together. They didn't know that this country would last as long as it has and so forth, right? But it's actually a miracle. It's still a document, and it's still our country. So the good news on that, this is all positive. So the fact that and I think you said it first, Sarah, and that is it starts off with we the people. It comes back to that. You know, all of our leaders and all of the governments that are there are really being hired by us, we the people. It's all about us, and how do we say safe, and how do we say safe, and how do we go forward? So that's my take on it. I think it's a beautiful intro.
You know, the thing
Yeah, and
the thing that stands out to me in all of this is the words, in order to form a more perfect union.
Right.
To me, that speaks to their experiences leading up to this. You know, they've had, again, about 150 years to get to where they got to in creating this thing. And it was all based on their experiences with England, their experiences with their own research and investigation into other forms of government going back to some ancient civilizations. So it's just, you know, they knew they weren't going to be able to create something that was going to be perfect. There was never, I think, any intent to do that based on what their experiences were. But, you know, that kind of stands out to me as, and we should never quit working on trying to make this union more perfect than it is. You will never get to perfect, but we just need to keep working on it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I know, Robin, you just put a comment up there, and I believe it was from Steve. Thank you. Yeah, Steve saying they wanted the government to stay out of our lives. I think you're right in that, at least to a very specific extent. They had a very clear idea of what was and wasn't in the purview of the government. The government had very specific, we can see here, very specific role, you know, and the rest of it, they were not supposed to be in. So absolutely, Steve. Absolutely. So then we move to like Article 1, Chet, and what do we got there?
Okay.
We have Section 1.
Article 1. Again, it's very short, but it again kind of sets the overview for, you know, or Section 1 kind of sets the overview for all of Article 1. And it reads, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. So with that short paragraph, they've begun to set up one of the branches of government.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A bit of background information that
Yeah,
I don't think it comes. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. John, did you have something?
Oh, I was just going to say that this is where they, you know, specify the role of the Congress, the House, and the Senate as a legislative branch. That is, the branch is supposed to be making the rules, the laws of the nation, and no other branch is given that power. However, today that's not the case. Instead, we have many bureaucrats that are unelected in the various departments and agencies, and even the president with executive orders, making rules and laws that we all must abide by. We've come a long way from this section where it's the role of the House and the Senate, the Congress, to make the laws.
They gave the power to the administrative state, the deep state, we might even call it today.
Yeah, it's nice that they were so clear, though, in the way that they divided it. They really did want clear division of power. And I think a lot of that goes back to history, because in England you had, when we talk about separation of church and state, well, that was just one of many crossovers of the different powers. You know, the executive in England had power over the judicial. I mean, how can you win in a system where the person who can accuse you can also try you and convict you? You know, that's not really a good system to live under. And so I think our founders really understood the necessity of taking a specific power and giving it to a specific group, and then having a different group have the other power, you know, and I really appreciate that about the way this is written so clearly. So with Section 2, we move on to specifically what is the House of Representatives. And of course, they just said that Congress is going to have the two parts, Senate and the House of Representatives. And so to summarize, we kind of have the main bits, which is that the House of Representatives is going to have members that are chosen every 2 years. So the entire House of Representatives turns over potentially every 2 years. I believe they say specifically that it's on even years. Do I got that right? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And then they have all the specifications. And it's very interesting to me that they have such specific, like you had to be 25 years old to be elected as a representative, and you had to have lived in your state for a certain amount of time, and you had to have lived in the country for a certain amount of time. So they had very specific bars that you had to meet to be able to represent the people that you lived around, which, you know, in that day and age, probably you had a lot of people coming in, probably in a way, much like now. And so they really wanted to make sure the people who were representing them were people who I guess had been around long enough to kind of get the feel of the community that they were representing, which is interesting. And then you have a much larger section that talks about how they're going to assign the quantity of representatives per state. And some background information here that I don't think is addressed in the Constitution is the fact that we have both a House and a Senate, because the states that were large wanted to have more power than the states that were small. And of course, the small states wanted to have equal power to the states that were large. And so they split the difference. And in the Senate, all states have equal representation. But in the Senate, everyone has equal representation per state. But in the House, everyone has equal representation based on quantity of population. And so they kind of made it so everybody kind of got a bit of what they wanted, which is very, very clever. And then it goes into a little bit on the different ways that you could fill vacancies, as well as gives the power of impeachment solely to the House of Representatives. So if you're going to have someone check the executive branch and say, sorry, that president is out of line, the only people given the power to do that is the House of Representatives.
So I find it interesting that the House is really the voice of the people, you know, because it does represent the people. Also, the bars, as you mentioned, the hurdles in order to be a member of the House are set a little lower than the other branches. Only 25 years of age. Others, there's a older requirement for age, and also a longer time of being a U.S. citizen. So this is more of the people's branch, so to say, or the people's representation.
Mm-hmm.
In the Senate, who votes whether you are guilty or not, it has become the deliberative body. You know, it's set up to be more of a deliberation body as opposed to passing the laws. So kind of interesting, but kind of logical the way they set it up.
Mm-hmm.
So did you notice the part about if somebody leaves that office, or there's a vacancy in the office, who gets to appoint a replacement?
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was pretty good that they laid that out.
They were really very thorough in the way they thought through the document.
Yeah, exactly. And they thought about different circumstances. So as the population grew, they knew there'd be more members in the House. So they recognized that. I think they thought it out pretty well. I don't know how they did all that, but they did.
Well, they deliberated, Shay, for I think it was 87 days out of 120, something like that.
Impressive, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very, very.
Yeah, this is also where there's a change in this section based on the 14th Amendment, Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, and that is the way they count the number of people in the state. Originally, all free people were given one count, but then those that are excluded Indians and also 3/5 of all other persons that weren't free. And that was later changed, of course, in the 14th Amendment, giving
That makes sense.
each person a voice, representation.
So that gets back to Sarah's
good.
point that they did the best they could do, but we recognized later that something had to be modified and updated. So that's a good example of that.
Yeah, they made some compromises to get this Constitution written. They made some compromises.
Absolutely. Chet, you want to take us into section 3?
All right. So this next section in Article 1 begins to, or does in fact, set up the structure of the Senate, how they're to be chosen, their terms of office, age. It says no person shall be a senator who shall not obtain the age of 30 years and 9 years a citizen of the United States. Okay. I would have to think in their time, 30 years old would be a fairly senior official. So I find it, it's interesting. It's a matter of perspective, I guess. But even though they had the perspective they had at that time, it's held up pretty well. I mean, I don't know that you would want, the Senate is supposed to be the senior section of the Congress, senior to the House of Representatives. So I suppose it's natural that they would be older than the House itself. They set up as they go through this. They actually do it for both, but in this section they set up, how they're going to choose the officials, the officers of the Senate, how they're going to vote, how they're going to take care of. For instance, the vice president is given the ability to break a tie should it be necessary, but otherwise cannot vote. So they've set that up, anticipating those kinds of situations again, as we've mentioned before. Going forward, they've done a masterful job of anticipating how things were to be, even in this present day and time. While the House has the right for conducting the impeachment trial, the Senate actually, or conducting and posing the conditions for impeachment, the Senate actually conducts the trial and determines guilt or not guilty based on what they do as a part of that process.
I thought it was especially interesting that in the event of trying someone who had been impeached, the Chief Justice was called upon to preside over the whole thing. They basically, in that sense, they join the neutral theory judicial system with the legislative to put a check on the executive. And so I thought that was really quite eloquent in its way.
And that probably, agree or not, but that probably is one of the first checks of the check and balance system on at least the executive branch of the government. It's a pretty significant check that, if things get out of hand, there is a way to check and balance that particular part of the government through this impeachment process, which is, again, pretty unique, I think, in a lot of historical accounts of government. So again, as we have seen, we've been through that process a few times, even in what you'd call the modern era.
Well, and it's interesting how the structure here of the Senate is set up to ensure that there isn't chaos, right? There's very little that happens quickly. I mean, even the election of senators is set up so that, unlike the House that switches over entirely every 2 years, it takes 6 full years to switch out the Senate because they only elect 1/3 of them every 2 years. So if you have a Senate that is hugely opposed to something that you're trying to get through, it's going to take 6 years before you're dealing with something entirely different. It's not just like 1 year you have an election and you blitz everything out and boom, the world changes. This is a process. And to the same effect with the impeachment, yes, the House can impeach, but the Senate has to try And they can't just, you know, majority decide we don't like the president. It has to be 2/3 of both houses. Excuse me, 2/3 of the members of the Senate, not both houses. And then they actually remove the president. But 2/3 is a really high bar. So by doing that, they basically ensured that you're not just going to willy-nilly be getting rid of the president because somebody don't like him. You know, this is really a very controlled process where you're going to have an overwhelming majority of the population in support of something to see dramatic change.
Very high bar, just like getting the COS resolution passed by ultimately proposed amendments becoming amendments or 3/4. Very high bars. Very high bars.
Yeah.
They made it slow and steady by the way they designed a lot of this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find it interesting in recent time in history, we've been through a couple of impeachments here recently with both Trump and Clinton, and neither one, you know, under trial in the Senate was removed from office. But you go back farther in time to Richard Nixon, and they never got to this. You know, if ever there was anyone who could have been impeached, it was him. But he obviously made the decision to get out before that were to happen. So it is a very high bar, and it does carry with it a lot of weight as to what the outcomes could and most likely will be if this process is ever invoked.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes, indeed.
I find it interesting that the Senate originally, as set up by the founders, was not supposed to be a direct election of the people, but it was supposed to be chosen by the state legislature, and because they didn't. They wanted the decision made more by the state overall, not individuals. And of course, today we have really the way they set it up was only the House is elected directly by the people. Even when we get to the president, we see that it's electors. It's not actual individual votes that specifically elect the president. But then in the 17th Amendment, this was changed, and having taken the Hillsdale course on Constitution 101, they talk about how apparently there were issues with the legislature being of the different states giving favors to people in order to get them elected to the Senate, and so they found that it wasn't working so good because there was, I guess you could say, some shenanigans going on that weren't truly representing the state anymore, and therefore they moved it to the direct election by voters. Although there may be some other ways around it to control that more tightly and allow the states to the legislators to make the selection.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well,
probably one of the strengths.
That direction.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, probably one of the strengths of the way it was originally written was that the state legislatures could basically be the parent of the Senate and make sure that their senators were in fact serving the people and were in fact representing the interests of the legislature as a whole, as opposed to any specific faction. So the states probably on some level could have gotten better representation under that system, barring shenanigans, of course. But yeah, it's an interesting, I think, thing to think about, the difference in the dynamic between the way it was originally set up to the way that it is now. So, yeah, very interesting. Speaking of elections, Chet, do you want to take us into Section 4?
Sure. Section 4 makes it pretty clear that the states are the ones who are responsible for setting up the election process, I'll say, within each state, and it's very, very clear as to how that's to be. But it also provides an out there that Congress can, by law, adjust that if they think it's necessary and proper to do so. Again, they would have to go through the usual deliberation and debate in order to actually make something like that happen. So once again, the high bar shows itself even in something like this, where it comes to, time and place of election and whose responsibility it is. I find it interesting, and I'll just read this. The Congress shall assemble at least once in every year, and such meeting shall be on the first Monday in December, unless they shall by law appoint a different day. So they had a much different expectation on how much our legislators should work. Okay.
It's once a year.
Once a year, they're to convene and do some work. And so now we've gone from that to a full-time, I'll say overpaid, maybe not overpaid, but now you've got a full-time government, where our framers had a much different view of how things should be. And I think, what they felt and what they wanted back then should still apply today. We've probably grown well beyond certainly what they anticipated at meeting once a year, but even with a little bit of growth, I don't think they at all anticipated the kind of government we have today, where it's almost 24/7, 365 days a year, barring recesses and things of that sort. I guess you could argue when they come home they're still working, but it's just, to me, stands out as it's what they wanted to have happen. And if you look at what's going on today, it's far, far different from what they anticipated.
Well, and then just take that point a little bit farther, and that is that, they anticipated that people would come from their farms and be a senator for a couple of, the 6-year period, and then they'd go back to their farm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that is not the case now, and it's certainly not the case in the House. Somebody gets into a House position now, they get elected 2 years, and they're there for what, 4, 5, 6 terms? That's not what we anticipated. That's not what the Constitution really anticipated either at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely the career aspect was not what was envisioned originally. This was very much a service thing, and it probably was not remotely economical for the people who were serving to leave and go and have to do this at that time. So, I mean, this was not a get rich sort of deal at that time in history.
Well, and we weren't supposed to be creating nobility either. That came out in some other piece of that. And that's what we've done. We've created the nobility, being the House of Representatives and the senators who are there forever. And all of a sudden that's becomes the ruling class. It's like, that is the antithesis of what I think the framers really wanted when they talk about this Constitution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They knew that the more that they met, the more they would intrude in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What I found interesting was
that turned out to be the truth.
Yeah.
was originally they met in December, early December. So they took office in January, and yet it wasn't until the end of the year, just a few weeks left in the year, that they met. And and now they start meeting the very day that they take office, January 3rd. It's also interesting that they take office before the president becomes officially takes office on the 20th of January. So they could really take office, meet, and quickly make some rules that might change things before the new president takes effect. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think we should point out, because I don't think we said it yet, that this section with regard to Congress making laws regarding the election that override the state. It's only applying to the election of senators and representatives. So it isn't applying to any state level elections at all, only to that one. So they could say that, you have to elect senators or representatives on the 15th day of April every year, but they can't tell us that that's when we have to vote for our governors or
Right.
our, anything like that. So
Right.
Right.
let's see what Steve has to say here. Something I would like you folks to notice, other than the language of the time, the Constitution is pretty straightforward until the 900-page bills that are passed now. Yes, 100%. 100% very straightforward and far shorter. They got it all in, what is it total, Chet? What are we dealing with here? Nowhere near thousands. Gosh, the Constitution.
Lucky to be 50
40
pages.
pages. Yeah, depending on your print size here.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Some of us.
And that's
print
including the amendments.
big. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, absolutely. All right. Well, Chet, you want to take us into section 5?
Okay. So this deals with, how the rules of the House shall be conducted. I think it puts that, if I understand this correctly, the House is in charge of elections and returns and counting, as we've witnessed, in the last presidential election. So the House is responsible for doing that. The House is commissioned to set up its own rules and how it's going to, and the word is punish here, but to the conduct of its own members and the rules by which they all must abide and live by. They're to keep records of what they do, and these are to be made public. Including the votes for and against different pieces of legislation. Then it talks about adjournment and how they're able to do that, or what, and how long they can do it for. But it's interesting. I think maybe in the next section, the House can't adjourn for any more than like 2 or 3 days without, or if it's more than that, they have to get agreement from the Senate to be able to do that. So it's a matter of, again, it links the two houses in some regard, but it sets the tone for how they're going to conduct their business, how they're going to conduct themselves internally as a House of Representatives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If anyone isn't aware, you can see those journals. There are journals of the proceedings of the houses. You can find them online, digitized from way back when. If you're ever looking for something, it can actually be really interesting, although time consuming to sort through those. Some of them are very, very long, but they have just fun tidbits from history. They'll mention conversations and all kinds of things in there. So if you're ever interested, I'd recommend looking up the Library of Congress or something like that and taking a look at these journals, excuse me. I do find it interesting that they in here basically put down the you can't play hooky place. So, they basically say if you go and try to play hooky, everybody who's not playing hooky can get you in trouble. And I thought that was really funny because, especially if they're only meeting once a year. And if they have to have a certain number of people to be able to do something, which is what it says here, then I could see getting a little annoyed if there's a certain number of people who don't want to show up,
Right.
Also, they took it very seriously. The fact that they have in here a means to expel people. I mean, they took their service seriously. This was not a joke to them. This was something they expected to be professional, and, to be treated respectfully. So just very interesting. All right. Well, Chet, you want to take us into section 6?
Okay. This is about compensation in some primary sense. They're to be paid, they're going to be paid, of course, with tax dollars from the government treasury. Uh, the one section I don't really quite understand is no senator or representative shall during the time for which he was elected be appointed to any civil office under the authority of the United States. And does that mean they can't hold any other office than the one they currently have? Is that what that's telling us?
That's the way I interpret it.
I
Okay.
think there's further qualifications there when I read it. It looks like they're saying specifically that they can't be appointed. And if anyone in the comment section knows more about this, please chime in. But when I read it, it seemed like they were saying you can't be appointed to a civil office that had been established during the time that you were appointed to be a representative. So basically, you took part in creating an office that was a civil office. You couldn't then be appointed to that office, nor could you be appointed to an office, I believe it said, where the emoluments thereof shall have been increased. I looked up emoluments to make sure I understood it correctly. And yes, it means money. So if basically you made it so that there's a position where people were going to get paid more, you couldn't then get yourself appointed to that position during the time that you were elected in office. At least that's the way I read it. But please chime in if anyone's smarter.
Yeah, this also sets up, the immunity from arrest, while they're in office, and I think even to and from their offices and their place of work, they're immune from any kind of legal proceedings while they're actively in office and working, which I don't necessarily agree with, but.
Well, there are some limits on that. They said except for treason, felony, breach of peace. So there are those particular exceptions. They do say, however, that they are immune from being how do they put it here? Basically, they can't be prosecuted for the things they say during debate in either the House
Right.
or Senate, which that seems to be a pretty important point, because that's definitely something that's in debate right now in our country, and maybe not so much the Senate, although I could see us going there in the future with all the conversations we're having. Are they allowed to have certain things brought up in debate? And this is pretty much saying they need to be immune when having these particular discussions. So that's a very interesting thing that they stuck in there.
Find it interesting, when they set this up, they didn't set any dollar limit on the compensation.
Yeah.
So I'm sure, as we pointed out earlier, they came from their farms to do their governmental work and then returned, but there's never been any mention of what that compensation should be. I know there's one of the amendments I think set that later on, so they did correct it, but at the time, the compensation was not something that was high on their minds as needing any kind of official pronouncement or description. So it's just an interesting thing to me that, compensation, while it was addressed and where and how you're to be paid, the amount was never discussed.
Yep.
Very different from
Yeah,
nowadays.
yeah, they definitely want them to focus on their job.
Right.
Again, the clause about not holding other offices.
But if you look
This
at
was
the
to
way
be
our towns or our townships are structured today, that's exactly what happens. The township supervisor or those people, trustees, don't get paid. They come from their workaday world. They come and they do their job and they go home. And I think that's what the founders were really thinking, that this was going to be.
Good point. Good
Yeah.
point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the world was also smaller back then in many respects. I mean, the country was a lot smaller.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure transportation still took a long time. I have to give the founders props that they wrote something that allowed for us to go from 13 states to 50.
Right.
I mean, that's such a huge difference. And yet they put something together that was able to adjust with us over time to make it this far. That's pretty darn impressive.
They were brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. Absolutely, Steve. That's a good point. They wouldn't have been raising a lot of revenue. Yeah.
Well, and the
Well,
other thing, the other, and, you know, again, making comparisons from today to back then, you know, the fact that they were able to create a structure that would withstand technology advances and increases. I mean, we just do things faster, which maybe is not good, but the fact that this structure still works in the environment in which we find ourselves today is pretty amazing to me. You know, it used to be you put something on a horse and you ride for a day and deliver it. Now, in microseconds, information is communicated and disseminated, and it still works. It still works.
Mm-hmm. I think that there is a value, perhaps, in us as a people re-embracing um, the slow, the slow aspect of the way our government is intended to function. Because I think we hear a lot of frustration about how come this isn't fixed now. Let's have the election and fix it now. And to some extent, the ways our government has changed. You know, a president takes office and they write a million executive orders and try to change everything now. And we'll talk about the executive branch and how it relates to what the Constitution has another day. But I think that that's very much out of the spirit of the original document, where the huge changes like that weren't supposed to be a sweeping now. They were supposed to be everyone agreed, therefore we make this change, or at least such a significant portion of the population agreed that we make this change. And when you consider it in that way, a lot of the panic people feel nowadays with the changes and with the elections disappears in that context, because you can't have those sweeping changes under the original version of this, right?
Right.
Well said.
So in section 7, we go into the legislative process. How do they actually pass legislation? And basically the power to raise money, or to submit bills to raise money, was given to the House. So it has to come from the House. The Senate can't say we want to put forth this bill to ask for money. It has to be the House that does it. But then the Senate has to agree, and they can propose amendments to whatever the House suggests. And then we get into how the bill actually becomes law. And that's where we see the checks and balances getting flipped and going towards the legislative, where the executive, the president, has the authority to say, no, sorry, I'm not signing that. And if this president, of course, says that and vetoes, then it goes back to both chambers, and they need 2/3 of both chambers to say, no, we really want this, in order to push it through, which again goes back to that slow and steady and majority of people, where if you can't have both the Congress and the executive in line, then you have to have a majority of the people's representation in line together, which is pretty brilliant, in my opinion. And then, of course, they have, if the president decides to just say, I'm not touching it, I'm not saying yes or no, in 10 days, it does actually become law as well, which is an interesting caveat. Do you have any other things you would point out in there, Chet?
Well, I had something here and it's left me, so I guess I don't at this point. No. Again, it's the system as it was created back then is the same system that's in process and in place today. So it's relatively unchanged from when it was originally created, which is really something in and of itself. But they certainly anticipated the ability to revisit things if it were necessary. If the two chambers felt that they were right and the president was wrong, they included an ability to override that and still prevail if because they probably represent the people in a more direct way than does the executive office. So they've provided for the ability to prevail in that instance. So again, it's the slow and steady thing that you've been talking about, Sarah.
Mhm. Mhm. I'm looking at Steve's remark about how the states paid in $663 into the federal treasury from 1786 to 1787. I'm trying to figure out what the inflation rate is on that. Sorry, guys, I'm Googling here.
Yeah, see, that's $300 million today.
Well,
Yeah,
that's what I'm
right.
trying to figure out. What is it today? Goodness.
Well, it is $5 trillion today.
Yes, right, exactly.
Let's see here. Well, it says it's from what I'm Googling, if you want to trust that. It's a price increase of about from then to now, that's about 3.2000% increase.
So if you also look at this thing carefully, it doesn't say anything about that this budget had to be balanced or that there was anything in here that said, you have to spend within your means or anything else. So what did you say it was, Steve? $632 coming in that year? Well, it doesn't say you can't spend more than that. That's a bit disturbing.
Okay, so I found another calculator. Sorry
Uh-oh.
to change the topic real quick. They say, according to this calculator, that $663.1787 is the equivalent of $22,000 in 2024. So not as much as you would actually think, which I think goes more to your point, Steve, that they really weren't taking in a lot.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and even if you split that among all the senators and representatives and the president, it's not much money.
$1 a piece, yeah.
A buck a piece, yeah, a buck a piece. We're rich.
Well, a dollar back then bought a county today.
Yeah, it's all relative.
It went a heck of a lot farther.
Yes, it did.
But still, minor pay
Yeah.
for a person to serve.
Yes,
For sure.
yes.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
you mentioned that there's no specification that they can't spend more than they bring in. I'm not sure that actually ever occurred to them.
No, because it was small numbers. Yeah. Why do we have to worry
these
about
are all people. Yeah, well, there are also people who have their own businesses, their own farms. They know that they don't spend more than they bring in. If they go into debt, they know that it can be catastrophe for them.
Right.
So I don't think that they really addressed it because they didn't think it would be a need.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's an oversight, in my view.
Well, and they do, if we want to move into Section 8, they do address borrowing money, which is interesting.
Yep.
Do you want to take us there, Chet?
Okay. So in Section 8, we begin to, the very topic we ended with here. They begin to lay out the revenues, the revenue streams, how to manage that when it comes to debt. It's interesting, they focus on debt as opposed to, again, whether the members are paid or anything. They focus in Section 8 on how to take the revenue and manage the debt that obviously they incurred fighting the British. So again, it was they defined a number of ways in which they can collect money, through various taxes and fees of different operations around the country. They talk about, one of the weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation was money. The central government under the Articles had no ability to borrow, no ability to do anything like that, let alone manage debt. So they've rectified that here at Section 8.
Mhm.
And of course, the other thing, is delegating how to interact with foreign nations from a commerce point of view, but also within the states themselves. They've defined that in a rather specific way. They also talk about something that's really important today is the rules of naturalization. How people are to be naturalized and made citizens of the country. They don't talk necessarily about immigration itself here, but that comes next. But how a person can become a citizen. They establish money and how they're going to manage the value of that money. The weights and measures are, is something that was uppermost in their minds, I'm sure, during those times. A lot of the trading and sharing back and forth was based on the ability to know how much of something they were dealing with. So the weights and measures was pointed out. Again, sticking to the money piece, you can't print and make money, at will without being punished for it.
Right.
So that was set here. They established a common currency, and if people start to compete with that, there are going to be punishments for that as well. Now it's interesting. Of course, the federal government is printing the common currency today, so that's why they don't get in trouble, I suppose. Of course, they set up the post offices and the post roads, and I think those two are probably connected. When it comes to communicating and delivering the mail, they had to have routes and whatnot to be able to do that consistently and easily. So those were set up. The next one is an interesting one to me: promoting the progress of science and useful arts. That I think is the forerunner to what we know today as patents, setting and creating patents for the creations of the citizens in the country. So they don't call it that, but it's there. Setting up they also, without any reference to any other branch, they set up to constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. So they're setting up in advance a significant portion of the judiciary when they do that. Penalties and whatnot for crimes of the high seas, the ability to declare war, and how to deal with open seas and acts of piracy and criminality on the open seas. They introduce the notion of the Army and the armed forces and the military as they do this, how to pay for it, how do it's interesting. They talk about armies and navies, and of course there was no Air Force at the time and no Marines, but those were the two main branches. And again, born out of experience they had with the British, and especially the naval ships that the British brought forth. And then it goes on to talk about the militia itself, and how they're to be governed, how they're to be controlled. How the rank and file, the officers and the structure is for the military. They've set that up. And interesting that to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever, or such district not exceeding 10 square miles, as may by secession of particular states and acceptance of commerce become the seat of government of the United States. So are they setting up, the I guess the city, the place of the seat of government? Is that what I assume that's what that's trying to do? So,
As well as, like, I think
As
military
well
bases.
so you think it's military
Right.
bases instead? Okay,
As well.
all right.
Yeah.
So there's a lot here, and it goes toward, fleshing out. I would say the skeleton when it comes to the weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation. This, to me, Section 8 gets at rather directly what was a huge weakness in the Articles of Confederation.
Mhm. Well, and I think there's two things about this section that are interesting. One, what it has in it, and one, what it doesn't, right? There's so many things we see the government doing that aren't listed here. And we could probably spend a long time talking about all of those. But the specific things here that they have that they are supposed to be focusing on, there's a lot of military. Honestly, the post office thing, when I first read through it, I thought, really? There's no mention of education or medical or food or all these other areas that the federal government has its fingers in, but the post office is there. And when I thought about it more, I was like, well, yes, that would make sense. Communications throughout a country and all of this is kind of really important to the safety and security of the country. But at the time, it was just kind of funny. It's like, of all the departments out there that aren't listed here, post office, where we have all these other people out there that deliver mail for us, it's actually the post office that is in here. So that was very interesting to me personally.
Yeah, they might have included the internet if it was there at the time, for communications. And also just the infrastructure that we have within the country. I mean, these are all things that were intended to keep the country running and operational, but not to take power away from the states. Only things that the states couldn't do on their own, that you had to coordinate with all the states.
Mm-hmm.
I think Steve has it right too. Section 8 is their enumerated powers. We talk about that all the time. What specifically was the government empowered to do? And Section 8 kind of points directly at that.
It sure does. It sure does.
Yes. And when you take this list of the enumerated powers and you compare it to the government now, it starts to be very clear which sections we have kind of gone beyond the original intent of the document.
Yes, especially in the area of commerce. And, they very specifically, we're talking here about commerce with foreign nations among several states and with the Indian tribe. So it wasn't meant to be, within a state. And now, because of a couple, 2 or 3 major Supreme Court decisions, we've really set that on its head, where the government has an extreme amount of power in commerce that goes on throughout the country, including within each state.
Yeah, 100%. That's the reason why everything in our lives are now regulated, because when you read these enumerated powers, it's not in there. Why, when I try to get a new water heater, they tell me, sorry, you can't get that kind. It's illegal now. It's because of some messed up stuff when it comes to interstate commerce. So absolutely, we have strayed rather far from this particular list of enumerated powers. But that's why Convention of States is here, because we can fix that. But we're not on Article 5 today. All right. Well, Chet, do you want to take us into Section 9?
Okay. this is an interesting one. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states shall think proper to admit. I take that to mean they're still talking about slavery to some extent, that they're trying to put a limit on people coming into the country, and the way to do that is to impose a fee for people coming in. Do I have that right?
I don't know.
I don't think that, because they put a time in here, a time for 1,808. It makes me think that it's maybe a first shot at controlling the slave trade by putting a fee on people who normally were brought into this country as slaves without any expense to the slavers. So I'm wondering if maybe this isn't the first pass at trying to address that going forward, because they go from that to the privilege of writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended except for cases of rebellion or invasion. You've got to be able to have your day in court, so to speak, personally.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not 100% sure, but it could have been, in the space of slavery, Chuck.
Well, since I've read that, it's been swimming around in my head. Is that what I mean? I don't think they're talking about, because they couldn't have foreseen the kinds of migration of people into this country we have today. So I don't. The only thing they had, I think, were the slave trade and the people being imported in that manner. And so rather than wholesale preventing it and making it illegal, they put a fee on it to regulate it to some extent.
Does anyone know if there were immigration fees at that point in time? Because I know there were later.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. It's interesting to note on the next. It's interesting to note in the next paragraph that the first one to suspend habeas corpus was Lincoln.
Interesting.
Civil War.
Time of war, right?
Yeah, rebellion. Cases of rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
Very controversial, but he did it.
It goes on, to kind of finish this off, money, how money is to be dispensed from the treasury. It's got, and this is still true today. You can't spend money unless you've got a bill or something authorizing that expenditure. So it lays out that particular issue as well. And then here's where somebody mentioned it earlier: no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States. We're not a country of, at that time, we were not a country of elites and the powerful. Today we are, but they expressly pointed to that. Again, I think from their experiences with the British, the people came here as colonists as a common folk. They were not of noble stature or structure when they came here. And I think that was important. And it was important enough to put it in here, that, we're not going to start conferring on ourselves any of these titles of superiority. We're common folks, and we intend to live our lives in that manner. So I think it's probably speaking to that to some extent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and they kind of directly addressed the caste type systems, probably, that they had seen in various other places, by basically saying, you're always going to have economical classes to some sense. You're going to have people who make less money, people who make more money, live more land or less land, so on and so forth. But at the very least, they weren't going to let a title be a definer of what liberties you did or did not have in this country. And that's definitely something that was prevalent throughout other parts of history as a thing. Lots of titles.
Yeah, it's interesting that we take for granted that we have income tax, but income tax wasn't included here. Again, it wasn't until the 16th Amendment that income tax was, and it wasn't ratified until 1913. I think it started around 1835 or 1800s. And even then, the initial income tax was only 1 or 2%. So we've come a long ways on taking funds from citizens to run our very, very large overweight government.
Mm-hmm. Well, and they also made a point here of saying that no preference was to be given to any by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another. Really, just trying to make sure that the government remained neutral and wasn't playing favorites amongst the states. I mean, it's nice that that was like a thing from the very beginning, especially when you consider that so many of the states were sea bordering states at the
Right.
beginning. Obviously, nowadays that's not such a big thing. We have a lot of inland states, but at the beginning, I'd say almost all of them had probably ports.
Yeah, we wanted to make it fair.
Very much so. Very much so. So then when we move into section 10, we kind of move into the powers. We just had the powers enumerated to the Congress, and then we had the things the Congress is not allowed to do. And specifically, not that it's the only thing they're not allowed to do, but specifically they wanted to say, you can't do this. Now they have some powers that are specifically denied to the states. And I personally find it interesting that just a lot of these things are the states can't do the thing that Congress is specifically given the authority to do. Things like you can't make your own money. So Michigan can't have its own currency and California can't have its own currency. That is,
Right.
the specific area of the federal government. Yeah, very, very interesting. Anything you guys notice in section 10?
Well, again, it gets to the commerce between the states. They're not going to get in the middle. The state can't control that.
Absolutely.
It was an effort, I think, to clarify more of what the states can do, what the federal government can do, or what they can't do.
Mm-hmm.
So does that mean the state of Michigan can't have a ship of war?
Apparently not.
Apparently
at least
not,
unless
right.
there's
It's
a war
right in
on.
there.
Yeah.
It doesn't say Michigan, but it does say we can't have a ship of war.
Unless Congress gives us consent.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Interesting reading
we
this.
had a king at one. Yeah, we had a king at one time on Beaver Island. They had to send the Navy to
Yes,
take
we
him
did.
out.
Yes, we did.
Was it the Michigan Navy or was it the U.S. Navy?
U.S. Navy. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, stay within the law.
That's right.
Yeah. It was a Mormon, right?
Yes.
John, it was a Mormon. Yeah. Can't remember his name off the top
Yes.
of my head.
Yeah. I don't either right off. Yeah.
It's helpful to go through this and read this and understand and kind of understand what's going on here because, you think back, these guys were pretty smart. They put together this a number of years ago. And as Bruce indicated, it's over a lot of years of studying of other things and so forth. They got to this point, which is great. But it's really an interesting document as you get into it. So thanks, Sarah, for pulling this all together.
Yeah, there's a lot here. There's a lot here. You can debate this for hours, words here and words there, but it's a brilliant document because they studied history.
They did.
Yes.
And they wrote this to avoid all the frailties of what had happened before with forms of government for
Yep.
humans.
You know, and
Yeah.
what that speaks to for me, Bruce, is, you know, something we today don't do a very good job of, and that's going back into our history and learning from it.
Yep.
You know, they specifically chose to do that,
Yep.
set this whole thing in motion. I mean, the amount of time that they spent researching and reading and probably interviewing when they were in England, you know, to understand from history what had come before they embarked on creating the document that now is before us. And you know, we don't seem inclined to do a very good job of that today.
Well, that's for sure. I mean, they looked at what the Greeks did wrong. You know, what did the Romans do wrong? You know,
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Right.
Well, it is never too late to start, right? And this is a great day. So I want to thank everyone who joined us for this live stream. If you're seeing this after the fact, thank you for sticking around this far and listening to this discussion. Please do look for the downloadable link for the Constitution. If you did not see it in the chat, look for it in the description of the video. I'm sure we'll have it there for you. Take a look at Article 1 yourself. I mean, there's more than we could possibly cover there. Dig into it, leave your comments and your thoughts. We'd love to see those. But really, right now in our country's history, it's really important that we understand what it is we're trying to protect. What is it that our country is intended to do? What is our government intended to do? So that when we vote, we know what we're trying to achieve as a people. And frankly, the way you're going to get this country to look the way you want it to look is by becoming the people that are stewarding the country, stewarding the government, and really helping form it back into what it was intended to be to begin with. So thank you for coming. Thank you, Robin, for taking all of this time and being in the comment section and sharing all those comments with us. And we hope that you all have a wonderful evening and join us back here next Tuesday night at 5:30 for Articles 2 and 3. Let's finish up the trifecta and find out the rest of the structure of our government. All right?
Next week at 7:30.
Did I say it wrong?
Yes, you did. 7:30. And I also put the QR code up there for the petition. If we haven't gotten to Article 5 yet, but this is something we work on every single day. And please go to our website, sign the petition, get involved. We're helping build that education platform to help you get involved. And so we'll be back here next week and we will talk about Articles 2 and 3. That's the reading assignment.
That's right. That's right. All right. You all have a good evening.
Good night, all.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you,
Right.
Robin.